fervor. And so I know that, now, Kathy told me that you're a storyteller, so I'm sure you've got more than one story out of Romans that you're going to share with us today.
If you wave a 5-minute signal when you think we're about to run out of time here.
Okay, you got 5 minutes.
And you all come back next week and get Last week I suggested you read from Romans 15:4 and 5, and so some folks got the idea we're going to study Romans, but not today. I just had you read that so that you wouldn't forget what's there. But as long as we're there, if somebody who has a book would break open Romans 15 at verse 4, somebody with a big, powerful...
For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through endurance and through encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope.
How many of you could use a little hope and endurance and encouragement? Anybody? Well, how do you get it? What did you just read?
By reading everything that was written in the past.
When the apostle wrote that, when he said the things that were written in the past, he was referring to the Scriptures. So which specific Scripture was he referring to?
Hebrew Bible.
Hmm?
The Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, but which exact verse and book was he talking about? He said everything that was written, so which verse was he referring to? All of them. That's right. Okay, so if you want a little encouragement and endurance and hope, you look at those old Scriptures. Now, somebody read verse 5.
May the God who gives endurance and encouragement give you a spirit of unity among yourselves as you follow Jesus Christ. Continue.
That'll be fine. Okay, so he said, through these Scriptures, we get endurance and hope and encouragement. And now he says, this is a prayer, may the God who gives encouragement and hope, endurance, work that in you, and it'll happen through Christ. So, suppose you hired somebody to come and do some carpenter work for you, and they showed up for the job, but they didn't bring any tools with them. How much work's going to get done? Not much. So, when Christ came, he said, I've come to do a great work for you, and I brought my tools. And the tools are those old Scriptures. So, guess what? We're going to look at some of those old Scriptures. How many of you enjoyed our walk through the parables of Ruth and Esther?
Yes.
Well, God has given us what we commonly call a trilogy. A lot of stories these days are trilogies. That's because they didn't think the first one was good enough, so they add a couple more. Hopefully hit the jackpot somewhere. But the Lord's given us a trilogy. It starts with Esther, and it goes to Ezra, Nehemiah. Now, remember, those three writings were during a time when Israel was captive to the Persians, who had taken over from the Babylonians. And our book, the way it's written, is written like this. We get Ezra, Nehemiah, then Esther. But in the Hebrew book, it's written reverse. It's Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah is one book in the Hebrew Bible. But it starts with Esther. She's the one, remember, through Mordecai, overthrew the plan of the evil Haman to destroy all the Jews in Susa and in all of the kingdoms that the king ruled over. And then later, Ezra, who was of the priestly line, led a bunch back to Israel, to Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple that had been destroyed. And then after that came what used to be thought of as the shortest man in the Bible, Nehemiah. But somebody discovered that there was even a shorter guy than him, was Bildad the Shuhite. So put that down in your important data. We're going to look at Nehemiah. Now, I'm going to show you a picture here. This is Jerusalem during a dust storm. You see it's quite plain. You see a parable. What is it about a parable?
Deeper meaning.
Yeah, there's a surface meaning, and then there's
Two.
two meanings. The surface one that anybody can see, that looks like dust, doesn't it? But if you want to see what it really is, you got to dig deeper into it. One of the prophets wrote, "You will seek him and you'll find him when you seek him with all your heart." In other words, you can't just take a cursory little glance at it. You've got to dive into it to see what it is. So, we'll get to it in a minute. Anybody got Nehemiah looked at? This is where we're going to go. Now, I got to tell you this. This is going to take some time. So if the Lord returns before we're done, then we'll have all eternity to finish it up. We'll do what we can for now. How's that? If you're in a hurry, I'm sorry. Who's got Nehemiah chapter 1? How about just 2 verses, or just one verse? Verse 1.
The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa. Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem.
Okay. Remember what we said about, if you want to find out what things mean in the scriptures. By the way, the Jews never refer to something called the Old Testament. That's a modern term that we use. They just call it the scriptures, or the Torah, or the Tanakh. And the Tanakh is an acronym of Hebrew from Tav, Nun, and Chet, which means the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Sometimes in what we call the New Testament, you'll see a reference to the law and the prophets. It's all referring to these scriptures. So that's how they regarded that. Well, one way to find out what they mean is, we talked about it before, you've got to look up the meanings of the names. Now, there are a lot of names in Nehemiah. So I would guess that 99% of the people who read Nehemiah, by the way, how many of you have ever read Nehemiah? Is there anybody here that's never even looked at it?
Oh.
Most of you have read it. Most people that read it are just going to skim over these names, never bother to take the time to look them up. But I got to tell you this. The Lord put those names in there for a purpose, and they've been handed down to us for 2,470 years. So what do you think we ought to do with them?
Learn what they mean.
Yeah. It'll take time, but if you're patient, we're going to learn something here, okay? All right. First name is Nehemiah. Know what it means?
Comfort.
Comfort means the consolation of Yah. In other words, God comforting and consoling his people. Would you like to have some consolation and comfort? Well, that's what Nehemiah means. The next one that we ran into there was, he is the son of one named Hakaliah. Interesting name. It means the darkness of God, the darkness of God. When you're in darkness, what do you see? You don't see much of the darkness. But God says that to God, darkness is as light. So even though there's, Nehemiah is the son of one named darkness of God, God said, I will give you light. Remember in Isaiah, early part of Isaiah, it says, a light has shined in the darkness. The Lord has come to us with light. So even though there's darkness there, we don't have to live in it all the time. The next line, or the next name, it says that this happened, the story begins in the month of Kislev. So what? It's a Hebrew month. Kislev. Anybody have any idea what it means? Well, it's the 9th month of the year, of the Hebrew year. So what do we associate with 9 months?
Pregnancy.
Yeah, what'd you say?
Pregnancy.
Yeah.
Baby.
So what happens usually in the 9th month?
Birth.
The birth. So Kislev is a month that means the onset of birth. All right? It also, it's the darkest time of the year. It's the time during the winter time when there's the shortest days. Now, I got to tell you this, in Israel, it's almost on the equator, so they don't know anything about darkness like we do. But even there, and so it's called also the month of darkness. It's also called the month of dreams. Most people, when they have a dream, they say, I had a dream last night. Seems like dreams most of the time are associated with nighttime, darkness. But one of the most famous dreamers, and there's at least 7 different dreamers mentioned during the month of Kislev that they write from. But one of the most famous ones is Joseph. His brothers called him that dreamer. Well, his dreams, even though his brothers resented him and hated him for it, really were a picture of salvation coming. Joseph is a figure of salvation for the Lord's people. So that month of Kislev is a great month. What do you think? All right. It's also a time to relight the lamps, the lights of faith. So they light the candles a lot during Kislev. All right? Have you learned anything so far? Let's move on. Verse 2.
I read it. I got 1. Hananiah.
Okay.
Hananiah, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem.
Okay. Right. They were in a place called Shushan, which was the capital city. Some version call it Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, which reigns over 127 provinces, all the way from India to
Egypt, North Africa.
North Africa. Very good. So the whole, practically the known world was under that regime, and the capital was called Shusha, Shusa or Shushan. Name means lily white. Now when we say something lily white, what do we mean by that?
Pure.
It's pure, it's beautiful, it's the way it ought to be. But you know, names don't always truly indicate what the reality is. What do you think Susa really was? You suppose it was really lily white? There's a lot of cruelty going on in Susa. And a lot of, by the way, why were the Jews there anyway?
Captured.
They were in captivity. They were slaves to this. So you don't suppose they called the place lily white, do you think? Wasn't a very happy place for them. But while Nehemiah was there, he had a job, and he said one day a brother, or somebody, what he called a brother, one of the fellow Jews, came to him, and he came to him from Judah. His name was Hanani. And Hanani means gracious. That's a nice name, isn't it? What does gracious mean? Anybody know what it means?
Double meaning, like you can be gracious, or I guess that's grateful when you're a receiver, but when you're a giver, you're gracious too.
All right.
Pour on the blessing.
We survive because of the grace of God, don't we? So here was Nehemiah doing his job as a servant, one of the captives. And by the way, Nehemiah was likely born in Susa. Probably never been in Israel before. He was a young guy. there he was, doing his job as a slave of the Persians, and along comes someone who had been back in Jerusalem. And his name was Hananiah, gracious. So it's as though God was coming to Nehemiah with his grace. What does Ephesians 2 say? Everybody knows that one? By grace we're saved. So walked into Nehemiah's world, one named Gracious. All right? He came from Judah. Know what Judah means? It means celebrated.
Celebration, right?
Celebration, yes. Now normally, you celebrate when everything's going the way you want it to go, don't you? When it's a time that things are just the way it ought to be, that's when you celebrate. Well, the name means celebrated, but there wasn't much celebrating going on in Judah at that time. And he came with news for Nehemiah. He said, he came because he had been in Jerusalem with part of the Jewish remnant that was there that had survived the exile. You know what Jews mean? What does the name Jew mean?
Chosen?
No, doesn't mean chosen. Well, surprising, it means a descendant of Judah. Anybody who's a descendant of Judah is called a Jew. Well, what does Judah mean?
Celebration.
Judah means celebrate. All right? Now they came from a place called Jerusalem. Everybody knows what Jerusalem means, don't you? What does Jerusalem mean?
I don't know.
Jerusalem.
Oh.
Jerusalem is how the Jews say it. It means the city of peace. Salim is peace. Jeru is the city. Jerusalem, the city of peace. Well, there wasn't much peace going on at that time, but that's what the name of the place was. So he told, let's read verse 3.
They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire.
That was happy news, wasn't it? Now, Nehemiah had never been there, but he probably heard a lot about it from his other people, and this man, Hananiah, had just come from there with very, very bad news. Now, Nehemiah is a servant in Persia. What can he do about the problem of Jerusalem? If you were a servant in Persia, could you do anything for Jerusalem? You're not in a position to do anything, are you? You've got a job here to do. And you're not here voluntarily. They don't pay you for doing it. You're here as a captive. You got no choice. You do what you're told to do. Well, but he was brokenhearted. We're going to jump ahead a little bit. It just says that God gave him a real spirit of sorrow for this. He mourned and fasted and prayed before God for some days. And this was just a momentary thing. He was mourning for a long time because of what he heard. Let's look at verse 7 and 8. Reader?
We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instructions you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you were unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations.
Okay. So this is part of Nehemiah's prayer. He was praying to God, Lord, look at us. We've been unfaithful to you. The reason we're here in this captivity is because of what we did. It isn't because the Persians are bad guys. It isn't because you're hating us. It's just because we were out of order. That's called repentance. And so he said, we disobeyed the instruction that you gave your servant Moses. By the way, what the Jews call the Torah, and we interpret it as law, they call it instruction. If you're taking flying lessons, you have an instructor there. He's not there to force you to do things this way or that. He's there to teach you how to do it right. You want him to be there, don't you? So the Jews do not look at the law what we call the law is some binding thing that you must do this, you must not do that, or you're going to be punished if you do this. They look at it as the instruction. This tells me how to live successfully, and they want it. You know, the psalmist says, oh, I love your law. What he's really saying, how I love your instruction or your teaching. Well, he said it was handed down to us through Moses. What does Moses mean?
On out of the water.
Very good. Drawn out of the water or lifted out of the water. Remember what was Moses doing in the water anyway?
Saved.
He was being rescued from what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. The Pharaoh there had ordered that every male child under 2 years old was to be killed because he was afraid of an uprising that would come. And so Moses was among those. But his mother and his sister saw to it that he was saved by putting him in a little basket in the river. And who drew him out of the river? Yeah. The whole thing was, because he's drawn out of the water, that's what the name Moses means. And then he was rescued from death, lifted up out of it, in order that his people might be rescued. Kind of a picture of the Lord himself, is to be resurrected out of death so that all of us can come to that position. All right? Let's move on a little bit. Let's move on up to chapter 2. There's a lot of good words in here. If you want to take the time to look through them, you'll benefit. But I'm an old man and I don't want this to quit before I'm done. So.
I just would say one thing in
Go ahead.
the end of chapter 1. Who was Nehemiah? It says, I am a cupbearer to the king.
Oh, yes. I'm glad you brought that because I almost forgot it. He's a cupbearer. That's his job. Now, a cupbearer is a personal servant to the king, but probably also a food taster. What's the purpose of a food taster?
Poison.
If somebody tries to poison the king, one of his jobs is to take a taste. Is if he falls over dead, then the king is not supposed to eat it. But if he's doing fine and cheerful after that, then good. So, has he kind of got a risky job? There are plenty of people out there who like to poison the king, so every time Nehemiah picked up a cup of something, said, if I drink this, I might die. But that's his job, so he takes a sip of it. Now, why do you put that in there, you suppose, anyway?
Because one, he had a very trusted position with the king. The king
Oh, yeah.
trusted him. And two, he had the ear of the king.
Yeah. Right. He's right there next to the king every time the king says anything or does anything. Another part of the cupbearer or his personal servant, his job is to kind of be there to promote a spirit of optimism, be a good cheer for the king, because the king's got a lot of important decisions to make. A lot of things aren't good news for the king, and the king could get discouraged or get scared, or he could get angry or something. He needs somebody close to him to just kind of give him that little boost, and that was one of Nehemiah's jobs. All right? So let's look on a little bit further here. Chapter 2 and verse 1.
About 5 minutes, Jim.
Already? Okay. You want to quit in 5 minutes, or does this matter?
It's up to you.
How about 10?
Okay.
Okay.
Whatever you do.
When it reaches 10 minutes, give me the 5-minute signal. Chapter 2, verse 1. Quickly.
Early the following spring, in the month of Nisan, during the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was serving the king his wine. I had never before appeared sad in his presence. So, that's verse 1. Keep going.
Yeah, go ahead and read it next one.
So the king asked me, why are you looking so sad? You don't look sick to me. You must be deeply troubled.
And go on.
Then I was terrified, but I replied, long live the king. How can I not be sad? For the city where my ancestors are buried is in ruins, and the gates have been destroyed by fire.
Okay, thank you. This happened during the month Nisan. Nisan means, this is Hebrew, Kodesh Ha Yeshua. Kodesh Ha Yeshua means the month of Yeshua. What does Yeshua mean?
Jesus.
Salvation.
Messiah.
It's really the Hebrew name that's been translated into the name Jesus, which is a Latin name. You know, all the Latin names, not all, but many of them end with US, us. Cornelius, Justus, this us, that us, the other us, Jesus. But the real name is Yeshua. That's the Hebrew name, and it means salvation. So Kodesh Ha Yeshua means the month of salvation. So what happened this time during the month of salvation? We just read it. What
Nehemiah
happened?
gets a chance to tell the king his problem and from
So
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem is in ruins. Does it need salvation?
Yes.
And now we are at the month of salvation. Learn a little Hebrew. Kodesh Ha Yeshua, the month of salvation. So here's Nehemiah now. He comes to work one morning. He brought the wine for the king and gave it to the king. But he said, I've never been sad in his presence before. One of the jobs of the cupbearer is to be cheerful and upbeat and optimistic for the king. If he shows up sad, he's not the way he's supposed to be. And when you're a slave to the most powerful man on the face of the earth, Artaxerxes. By the way, remember what Artaxerxes means? We talked about Esther. Artaxerxes means the leader of the heroes, or the ruler of the heroes. Kind of a proud sounding name, wouldn't you say? So he really is. He's the big shot in the world. Nehemiah comes to him, but he's looking all sad that day. All right? And he really broken hearted. It's kind of hard to cover up sadness like that. King takes one look at it and says, what's the matter with you? How come you look so sad? And this isn't no ordinary sadness. This is heartbreak. And Nehemiah said, I was afraid. What's he afraid of?
Yeah.
Why?
He was supposed to be there to cheer the king
Yeah.
up, not to bring
This
him
king
down.
might not be too thrilled with him showing up looking like that. So he said, I was afraid. And but I said to the king, may your heart live forever. And then he says, why shouldn't I look like this when I hear about what's happened to the city where my fathers are buried? And they're all been broken down, the walls, gates destroyed by fire. Well, pretty straightforward what he told the king, wasn't it? He didn't know what the king would say. But the king said something pretty interesting right at that point. Next verse.
He
Verse
said
3.
to me,
Verse 4, I'm sorry. Go
what
ahead.
is it you want?
Yeah.
Then I prayed to the God of heaven.
Okay. It says the king said, what do you want? How many times would the most powerful ruler in the whole world ask a servant, what do you want? That's not a normal thing for a king to ask a servant. Why would he ask such a thing as that?
Well, they trusted and liked him. His life was dependent upon him, so there was some kind of bond there.
Perhaps. I wouldn't doubt that. Remember, too, all these old scriptures are about one particular thing. All of them. What?
The Lord.
They're about the Lord. Even this line, when the king said, what do you want? Almost like the Lord. Remember a little man named, a blind man named, no, not Bartimaeus. Say it?
Bartimaeus.
Bartimaeus, thank you. My old brain went on slump there. Here's a blind man seated beside the road, and along comes Yeshua with a whole crowd of people following. There's 500 people come walking down the road, and here's one blind guy sitting beside the road. And somebody told him, the teacher's coming. He starts yelling, Yeshua, son of David, help me. And they told him, shut up. He didn't have time for a guy like you. You're just a worthless, no good beggar. He's important. But the more they told him to shut up, the louder he yelled. And here's this poor blind guy who was absolutely without hope, sitting beside the road, and along comes Yeshua and gets down on his knees next to this man and says to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The ruler of the world, the ruler of the universe, kneeled down beside a beggar and said, "What do you want me to do for you?" Isn't that just about what Artaxerxes said to Nehemiah? What do you want me to do for you? Can you see a picture there of the Lord? One more minute?
About 3.
Oh, 3, okay. All right. Okay. Then he says, I prayed, and I turned and answered. The question was, what do you want me to do for you? If the king asks you a question, how long do you take before you answer it? Right now. But he said, between his question and my answer, in that instant, I prayed. This is the shortest prayer in the Bible that has a meaning. No words whatsoever. Just an attitude of I just gave it to God and then I answered the king. So, you know, Jesus said the Pharisees, they think they're going to be heard because they got 1,000,000 words in their prayer. But here's one little wordless prayer in a heartbeat of time that changed the history of the world. What do you think of that? So he said, I handed the matter to God and I answered the king. And the king had asked, what do you want? And he said, if it pleases the king, you know, one way we have to pray. The Apostle James said, if you pray, what you ought to be saying is, if this is what God wants, this is the way it is. So Nehemiah worded his answer to the king properly. If this is what pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you suppose he had found favor with him? Then let him send me back to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried so I can rebuild it. That was his prayer. That was his answer to the king. Well, is our time up? Okay.
Another minute or two.
If I milk this long enough, we'll get out of here by 5 o'clock. All right,
It's a
let's read
pretty
another
bold
number.
request, wasn't it?
Okay. Verse 8, did we read that one?
No,
No, we're not there.
we're on 6.
We just read,
Let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can build it.
Oh,
That's
yeah, okay, yeah, you're right. Okay, verse 6.
Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me,
Well,
how
just,
long?
excuse me, just a second. Important note here. The queen is sitting next to the king. Remember when Esther was the queen, what did the king offer her?
Half of it.
Half the kingdom. If he offers her half the kingdom, that makes her equal to him. So now, Artaxerxes is fault. This Artaxerxes is probably not the same one that Queen Esther was married to. That Artaxerxes is a title. But he's following in his steps. And so far, what do you think of this king so far?
He's kind of.
You like him?
Yeah.
Yeah. He's got a good heart attitude. He's not giving Nehemiah any trouble, is he?
No.
And now he's answering Nehemiah's statement with the queen sitting beside him as though with her backing and her support and her confirmation. Now go ahead and read your verse there.
Sitting beside him, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back?
Okay,
It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time.
thank you. Well, he'd asked him, let me go back and rebuild the broken down things. The king says, how long will you be gone? What does that tell you?
Yes.
You're going. All I need to know is, when can I expect you back? I like you here, I want you back. You tell me when you're coming back. How many rulers of the whole known world would ask a servant to tell him when to expect him back? He doesn't give Nehemiah one thing to, he doesn't tell Nehemiah to do anything. He says, you tell me. Nehemiah's kind of jumped up in rank, hasn't he? From being a personal servant, he's telling the king what the deal is. That's kind of neat, isn't it? Okay. There's a whole lot more here. If you want more, you'll have to come back next week. Oh, Have you got 2 more minutes? I'm gonna run something by you.
Do we have a picture?
I'll
Or is
give
that
you-
later?
Yeah.
Next
Oh, no,
week?
I'll give it to you right. Whoop. Stay there. Okay. Remember, this was a picture of Jerusalem in a dust storm, but here's a better picture. Now, if you were walking along a trail someplace, and you looked out the ground, and you saw something look like that, what would you think?
Footprint.
Footprint. Which foot is it?
Right.
Huh?
Right.
Right foot, okay. So I got to tell you this. Psalm 77, the last 2 verses of Psalm 77 says that we saw Moses and Aaron's footprints leading us through the Red Sea, speaking to God, but it was really you who led us. So the footprint we saw was the footprints of Moses and Aaron, but we recognized it was really God's footprint. I got to tell you, this is God's footprint. Doesn't make any sense, does it? What it really is a drawing. Actually, it's an exact duplicate. I did it myself. It represents the wall that Nehemiah was going to rebuild. And this weird shape it's made, it just follows the terrain of Jerusalem. If you ever get to Jerusalem, you'll find the whole city is like that. It's up and down. So the wall followed the terrain that was laid out. Who laid out the terrain in Jerusalem?
God.
So God decided what this shape would be like. It's amazing how it looks pretty much like a footprint, doesn't it? God put his footprint there. So when Nehemiah went to rebuild it, he didn't have to send out a surveyor and stake out lines. God had already laid it out by the hillside. And everything was laid out. So he just followed the hilltops and then rebuilt the wall. And there'll be a whole lot more next time. So love having you here. Come back again.
Any announcements, Dwayne? Good job, Jim.
Thank you.
Wow. Yeah, quickly for announcements, we have a